Okay, good morning, everyone. We have been talking about Coleridge's views on poetry, its nature and function. During our previous lectures, we talked about the origin of lyrical ballads and then the distribution of responsibilities between both the poets. And we also try to understand some of his views related to the difference or distinction between a poem and prose. In this lecture, we shall continue with that discussion. So let's try to understand how Coleridge distinguishes a poem from a prose composition. He tries to distinguish or bring out the difference between a poem uh, and a prose composition. So according to Coleridge, a poem contains the same elements as prose composition. We understood it in yesterday's lecture. Means there is no difference between a poem and a prose composition in terms of the elements. The elements are same. Both of them use words only. Okay. So the medium, the elements are words. So there is no difference between the elements of a prose composition and a poem. So what he says, we understood it in yesterday's lecture. Coleridge says, I quote, a poem contains the same elements as a prose composition. But only difference is to be noticed here is that of meter or rhyme, or both. Meter or rhyme, sometimes both are employed in a poem. So that is the difference. There lie the difference. We understood it in yesterday's lecture. A poem employs meter or rhyme or both. And these elements are not used in a prose composition. That is the basic difference. Further, Coleridge says that the immediate purpose of a poem is the communication of pleasure. When you read a poem, you get pleasure. So pleasure is the main purpose of a poem, while the immediate purpose of a prose is the communication of truths. It does not mean that a poem does not communicate any truth, but the main purpose is to give pleasure to the readers. Whereas in case of prose, the main purpose is communication of truths. And a poem must be an organic unity. Okay, and it differs from a work of scientific prose. Okay, because in case of a scientific prose, the immediate purpose is communication of information. Whereas in case of poem, its immediate object is pleasure, not truth. Truth is secondary. Pleasure is primary. When you listen to a poem, a song, I mean to say, a musical composition, our main purpose is to seek pleasure. Of course, through songs, you learn some truth as well. But basically, we listen to music for the sake of pleasure. So, same is the purpose of a poem, poetry. So, for that, for giving pleasure, meter, rhyme, etc. used. And we understood that they are not used in prose. So, if meter, you might be knowing iambic pentameter, dactyl, spondy, etc. are the meters. If meter is used in a piece of composition, that is a poem. But a poem cannot please us if there is no organic unity. That has to be understood. In order to give pleasure, in the poem, a poem must have an organic unity. Further, Coleridge thinks that the main aim of poetry is to give pleasure. Okay, So Coleridge does not regard meter as absolutely essential for poetry. That's the problem. It is not absolutely essential. He clearly said that poetry of highest kind may exist without meter. There can be a poetry of highest kind, which may exist without meter as well. But at the same time, Coleridge believes meter that meter is useful and necessary for writing poetry. Yes, his views seem to be contradictory, but he's truthful. What he says, it is not absolutely essential, but still it is necessary. So you can understand the difference between essential, something which is essential and something which is necessary, useful. Okay, so he is against for the use of meter and rhyme in poetry. Actually, means he gives examples of Plato, poetry without poetry means without this kind of meter and all. So meter and rhyme have been imposed on poetry in order to make it easily memorized. That is what. Why poets employ meter and rhyme? Yesterday we saw that example for memorization, easy memorization. So yesterday we saw that line, 30 days at September, April, May. So that makes us to remember easily. So here the use of verse makes it easier for schoolboys and others to remember the number of days in different months. Further, after talking about the difference between a poem and a prose composition, Coleridge establishes the difference between a poem and poetry in this text of criticism, Biographia Literaria. In his opinion, poetry is a wider term than a poem. It is an umbrella term. It's a wider term. Poetry is an activity of poet's mind, whereas a poem is merely one of the forms of its expression. That is the basic difference between a poetry and a poem. Poetry is an activity of poet's mind. It is a wider term, whereas a poem is merely one of the forms of its expression. So poetic creativity is an activity of the imagination. Okay, and poem is merely an expression of this particular activity. One of the instances you can see. So poetry is a kind of activity in which any creative artist, poets, painters, or scientists work. So he uses it on a wider level. It is applicable to even painters. It is applicable to artists. It is a kind of creative activity. If you have understood the difference between competence and performance, you might have studied it in unit number 1 of your uh, paper 3. Chomsky distinguishes between competence and performance. So competence is the underlying system and performance is the actual use of language. Even Saussure uses the term. Ferdinand de Saussure uses the term langue and parole. Langue is the underlying system, whereas parole is the actual use of that system in our day-to-day communication. So you can understand this particular difference between poetry and a poem in terms of langue and parole or competence and performance of Chomsky. Poetry is a kind of langue. It is a kind of parole. Whereas a poem is an instance of that particular knowledge, application of that knowledge, we can say, in our day-to-day communication. It's one of the forms of expression. So poetry brings out the whole soul of man into activity through the magical power of imagination. because poetry is the activity of imagination. So he identifies imagination with the soul of poetry. Imagination is a living power. Still, I also know that Coleridge fails to give the clear distinction between poetry and poem. But whatever I understand is that he uses poetry as a wider term, whereas poem is an expression of that creative activity, a form of expression. So you can understand it in terms of Lang and Parole by Saussure and competence and performance of Chomsky. Okay, so instead of defining poetry, Coleridge proceeds to describe a poet. Instead of defining poetry, he does not define poetry clearly. So from the poet, he proceeds to enumerate the characteristics of imagination. Means what? He explains, he illustrates the characteristics of imagination. And we already talked about imagination, primary imagination, secondary imagination, fancy and imagination, etc. So Coleridge's distinction between a poem and poetry is not clear enough. We understood that. It seems that this distinction does not have any kind of clarity. So by the word poetry, he means all kinds of imaginative activity. We understand that, including painting, sculpture, architecture, etc. It's a creative activity. And it has been used by Coleridge in a very wide sense to mean all the fine arts. You must have studied in it, UAB, fine arts and useful arts, etc. So all fine arts are poetry, according to Coleridge. So in this sense, he has drawn a distinction between a poem and poetry. A poem is a form of expression. It is a performance. It is a parole. So this is how we understand the difference between a poem and a prose composition, and then a poem and poetry.